You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Okay, I'm Pete Boettke. I am the director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center and a university professor of economics and philosophy at George Mason University. Today is November 19th, 2020, and I have a great privilege of speaking with my colleague today, Virgil Storr. And Virgil, thanks for this conversation.
Absolutely.
So we're going to take a little bit of a trip down memory lane a little bit. And as you know, the purpose of these conversations is to discuss the 40-year anniversary of the Mercatus Center. But in particular, in our case, to really, if we can, dig down into the lasting legacy of our teacher, Don Lavoie, and his ideas. And so I wanted to start by asking you to discuss a little bit about your journey to Don's ideas, your first impressions, and the lasting legacy of his influence on you as a scholar, teacher, and whatnot.
Yeah. So the journey to Don and his ideas that begins, I guess, at Beloit College, where I did my undergraduate work. It actually probably begins before I set foot on Beloit College. And so I show up at Beloit College as a 19-year-old kid who would have said, I'm a Marxist. And so, and it wasn't just like a superficial sort of Marxist. It was like, at least I had attempted to, I'm not sure I understood fully, but I had attempted to read a bunch of Marx's work, really influenced by like the German ideology and the economic and philosophical manuscripts, and so like the early style Marx stuff, but it attempted to read Das Kapital and that as well. So sort of really wanted to be an informed Marxist, and that's what I thought I was, at least when I showed up at Beloit. And I met Don in some sense in his ideas first through Emily Chamley Wright, who was a professor at the time, now close friend, but at the time a professor at Beloit College. Her first class at Beloit was my first class at Beloit, and so and so we met sort of in that kind of space. Had I showed up a year later or a year earlier, my whole life might be very different. And so I had a first for a standard micro class, intro to micro class, and that was fine. And you sort of, she was an excellent teacher and very clear, and I learned a lot about the economic way of thinking and that in class. But I wasn't really challenged in sort of the way I saw the world and the way I made sense of the world. And then I get into her comparative economic systems class, and that class, it's not an overstatement to say that single class changed my life. Yeah. That it put me on an entirely different trajectory than I would have been on otherwise. It's also the class where Don actually came in as a guest speaker, and so that's a footnote there too. And so it's the first time I met him was towards the end of that class. But so Emily did it was as if the class was made in some sense to change me. Yeah. In the way that she structured it. And so she begins the class, and it's Marxism all the time, right? And so the first half of the class through the October break was all about Marxism. And so we read, some Marx, we read some folks interpreting Marx and so secondary sources on Marxism. And she taught the class as if she was a Marxist. And by midway through the class, I would have said, she is a fellow traveler. She's, this figure that I can learn from. This is my way of getting more deeply grounded into sort of a Marxian approach to political economy. Like, and that's what I would have thought in that class. But the class sort of took on this characteristic of my fellow students occasionally being skeptical or raising points or concerns, and Emily and I standing on one side defending Marx against those critiques and skepticism. And so I was sort of thrilled. And I should have, and I didn't look ahead to the rest of the syllabus. Take the midterm exam, do extremely well in the midterm exam, come back and calculation debate, knowledge problem, Austrian critique. And so I left, your work on why, on war communism and why that was a real test of Marxism, but in fact failed horrendously. And so that was, and so I went from being convinced that I'd found like my guru in Marxism to her sort of introducing these critiques that I then couldn't sort of dismiss because I couldn't say, well, she doesn't really understand Marxism.
Right.
I was sort of set up where I was like, I had to take it seriously because she demonstrated that she was, in fact, a very charitable interpreter of Marxism. And so I read these critiques, and by the end of the class, I was just depressed because I hadn't yet given up on, and sort of, say a Marxian critique of markets or capitalism or what have you. But I was convinced that the solution that Marx proposed wouldn't work. Right. And so I was sort of stuck. I sort of had this, worldview. The worldview sort of articulated a challenge to the existing system. That challenge to the existing system I still thought had, some value, but the solution that it proposed not only didn't work, was probably going to be disastrous and lead to the deaths of millions, like gulags and deaths of millions of people. So I was just depressed. And so it actually, I left that class, and, sort of decided, okay, maybe this isn't what I'm doing. Like I'm not, And so I double majored at the time in computer science, computer information systems. And so I was like, oh, okay, well, go, I knew I was going to grad school. I'll go to grad school in that. I'll become a, professor of, computer information systems and what have you. And so that was sort of, I'll finish my econ degree for sure, but that wouldn't be where I would go. So I went to, so I sort of did that, right? And,
little did you know that's another connection.
Yeah. And so, right. No, it was completely. And so I did that, applied to graduate schools in, computer information systems, computer science, and like didn't get into my top choices, got into some decent schools, but sort of after having spent, I love Beloit College, but I didn't like the Midwest as a place to live. I'm from the Bahamas, so as a place to live from, December to April, I didn't exactly like that. And so, although like I got into Iowa was a great school for computer science, it wasn't, the prospect of spending time there wasn't exactly appealing. And so ended up getting a job offer to come work in DC and doing consulting. And so I jumped at that because it was like, I didn't, there's grad schools that I had to work at. And because I was working in computing, the stuff I'd spent the time outside of work, time I had, basically following up on the footnotes from that class, right? And so not just reading the, if she'd assign a piece of Mises' socialism, reading the rest of Mises' socialism. Right. If she'd assign a couple of chapters from Individualism and Economic Order, reading the rest of that. Sort of reading not just the rest of your first book, but reading by then Why Perestroika Failed, and so that book, reading Don's stuff, and about a year into that job, about a year into that job, two things happened. I became convinced that I didn't want to be a computer scientist. Like I was working in the field and doing, I guess, well in the field, but I was convinced I didn't want to sort of do computer information systems or computer science. And I was convinced that I wanted to go to grad school to do economics at George Mason University to study with Don Lavoie. Right, like, and so that was, and so that was sort of how I, sort of ended up here. And I actually, it was the only economics program that I applied to. That had applied to, sociology, I guess, programs at other places, but it was the only economics program that I applied to. And it's maybe the first thing in my life that I truly lobbied for. Like I showed up before the applications were due and met with Colleen Murata and met with Tyler Cowan and met with Dawn, and like, I really want to come here, and this is really, and this is, and so that was sort of my path to.
Yeah. I didn't know that Emily was in her first term when you were in your first term at Beloit, because that's serendipity related to you were at Mason in your first term, my first term at Mason as well. So it's kind of a strange kind of coincidence there. The other thing I was going to mention is that there is something weird about the people that gravitated towards Don. In many ways, I'm kind of not an outlier, because though my sympathies maybe never were as strong as anyone else. But my choice when I was deciding on going to graduate school was one of my alternative choices that I went and visited was the New School, because I wanted to go and study with Marxism so that I could study it so in depth that I'd be like the best critic of it, right? And so now the difference is that I went to a talk by Anwar Sheikh, and he was working on Bambavrick's transformation, the Marxist transformation problem. And I couldn't understand what he was saying. And so I just made in my head, I said, there's no way in hell I could survive, graduate school with this guy, because I have no idea what the hell he's saying. And since I don't understand it, it must be nonsense. So I'm going to go off and do something else. The funny thing is 25 years later, 30 years later, I actually saw him give a talk on the same subject. And I was sitting next to somebody, and I said, when I was like 22 years old, I saw him give this talk, and I was deciding about going to graduate school, and I decided that he didn't make any sense. So I decided not to go. So I'm really anxious to see what he says now, because so much what I learned. And about 10 minutes into it, I turned to the person, it's no different. So anyway, if you talk to Emily, if you talk to Dave Perchicko, or, any of the people that really sort of gravitated towards Don, there is this kind of willingness to be very serious about dealing with these alternative ideas and the importance of these ideas for the way we understand the world. And Don was great at forcing you to really read and be charitable and take on board a lot of the value system, I think, of your opponent, or not your opponent, but the right word for Don would be intellectual interlocutor.
Yeah,
the person you're having a conversation with. Yeah.
And so that's one of a number of things that he taught me, right? And so like he was such a honest broker in dialogue.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and so that, not only did he sort of preach that as being important, but he lived that, like, as being a real honest broker in dialogue, that a fair dialogical partner that was genuinely, when he asked a question, it was a genuine question. It wasn't a loaded question. It wasn't a setup question. It wasn't a gotcha question. It was I have this question about your what you're saying, what you're thinking, what you believe. And so that was certainly one of them. There's the second, sort of, when I sort of think about the things that he taught me, the second thing is a kind of, this is a Hayekian, argument. Hayek had made the same point, but it's just sort of, you had to be more than just an economist.
Yeah.
That it wasn't enough to be just an economist narrowly defined, that you had to read widely, and that we had, that he was famous for these readings groups. And, I'm an economics PhD at the time, and I'm doing readings groups in Gottimer with him, but not just him, but, students and faculty in cultural studies and philosophy and whatever else, stuff on like Hannah Arendt, that, and he's encouraging in our like conversations to, be talking about literature and to be talking about, and seriously, not just like lit studies, not just, and so he was, and so that was sort of like another value, right? And so, be an honest, broken dialogue, be more than just an economist. Don't take shortcuts was another one. The ideas were too important to take shortcuts. And so you couldn't, and that you should, sort of take on, again, this sort of like take on the standards, the values, the what have you of the people that you're talking to. And so if you're going to be doing, if you look at my CV now, it's kind of, it would be hard. Like I think it's clear I'm an economist, but you could position me in a bunch of different fields because there's like publications in a bunch of different, and that's a Don sort of thing, right? That you write in sociology, you should be writing for, you should meet the standards of sociology. Like, what are you doing? And then the other thing, I guess, sort of two more things. That one is he was so generous with his, like this one I fail on all the time, but he was so generous with his time, right? And like teaching, and he sort of really took seriously the role of being a teacher and being a mentor. And for his students, he was, amazingly generous. That he, when I was in graduate school, we met. I got assigned to him as a research assistant. My assignments for him as a research assistant, he occasionally would have me get something from the library or something like that. But most of it was, let's talk about economics.
Yeah.
And he would, you hosted the PPE workshop on the Fridays, and we would, he would take me to lunch every Friday before the thing, and the lunches started happening at 12, and then we had to like start them at 11 because the conversations that we had were like going longer, like we'd sort of be late to the seminar, and so we'd go to lunch and we would talk economics, and the conversation would end, and he would say, well, what do you want to talk about next week? Or he'd say, hey, it has this interesting paper, book, article, whatever, that let's talk about that. And we would talk sort of nonsense. So that was general, but he also read every paper I wrote in graduate school.
Yeah.
For like every course, like not just the courses he taught me, but for like every course. Yeah. And he gave me like, it turns out I'd gotten acculturated to his style of commenting from Emily.
Yeah.
Emily was kinder in the sense that Emily's, that she'd give you back papers and they would be bleeding. They would look like they'd been like stabbed and they were bleeding because there were so many comments all over it. She'd write in like aqua and purple though, and so it felt more gentle. Yeah. Dawn would write in red. Yeah. So it felt more harsh and you're like more, it was more bracing. But that kind of generosity to like, as a graduate student, I'm gonna read the paper that he's writing in Micro 2, that and give him comments on it and give him substantive comments on it is, and so that was, and then the final one was just, liberty is really important.
Yeah.
Like liberty is like freedom is extremely important, and it's worth arguing for, it's worth justifying, it's worth fighting for, it's worth championing. It's like a really important thing, because you can't have it's impossible if you care about human beings. You can't. We've not yet come up with a situation where human beings can be, where we can respect the dignity of human beings without, granting them liberty.
Yeah.
And so we've got to so that matters. That's not like a small thing. That's like an important thing.
But I think that's actually links all the way back to your first class with Emily, because the kind of concerns that would have led a young person to read seriously Marx and think about the nature of the human condition and freedom are the same things that Don was linking into. He just had a different, that's what made Don so fascinating is that he understood, and Pacheco used to say this all the time, because again, I came from the fee kind of world, coming from Grove City College. And I used to talk all the time to Pacheco about the freedom philosophy. I said, look, you don't understand the freedom philosophy. He used to say, no, I understand the freedom philosophy. Karl Marx has a freedom philosophy too. So do you understand what they're arguing or whatever? And that was that ability to understand that, and therefore that you have to engage in a serious conversation with people about and adjudicate fundamental questions about freedom and the nature of the human condition is significant, I think. It's also, I think, fascinating the way you talk about Don and his relationship to economics, because my experience, I went to graduate school from 84 to 88, and then I was gone for a decade, and then you went to graduate school in 1998 going forward, and so it's a decade in between the Don that you're having as a teacher. And so the Don that I had a teacher was an economist who had said what he wanted to say about economics in Rivalry and Central Planning, and understood, like Hayek understood in the Counter-Revolution, that there's something wrong with the way that we do economics or we talk about economics that doesn't allow people to understand the point that they're trying to make in the calculation debate. And so that forces you to have to continue to look at these other things. One of them is philosophy of science, but the other one is also institutions and other kinds of things, all of which Don, and the next decade, I'm on my own journey of what I'm trying to do, but Don is on his own journey as well as an educator, as a scholar, and he's looking at these different things. And so there's a continuity, but there's also different points of emphasis. So by the time, you show up at Mason, Don is actually not in the economics department anymore. He's now in the School of Public Policy and also in cultural studies, because he saw the interlocutors of that differently. So I want to ask you a question about CSMP, the Center for Study of Market Processes, and its evolution to Mercatus, just as an educational idea, which is that, but you didn't go into the School of Public Policy for your PhD, though. You went in the economics route. So in a very strange sense, what you do is you're pursuing a kind of educational path very similar to my educational path. But at the same time, Don and Jack, and you work with Don and Jack Hyde, this is, but they're not in econ anymore. And so you're having to figure out this kind of unique way in which to have a very similar Center for Study of Market Processes education that I had and experience that I had, but also different because you're adjudicating between your duties at the center, which is now the Mercatus Center, and your duties intellectually with PSOL and what they're doing there. How did you see the challenges with that and the benefits maybe of that in a strange way?
Yeah, and so it was interesting the world I came into, because I'm not sure I understood all of that before showing up, right? Like, I think when I showed up,
neither did I, and I was there.
And so I thought, my undergraduate teacher, Emily Chamley Wright, had gotten her PhD in economics from George Mason University, studying with Don Lavoie. Don Lavoie was at George Mason University. That seemed, so I think that's what I maybe understood. And that the Center for the Study of Market Processes had become this, or was becoming this other thing. And so it made sense that that would be the kind of place that I would want to be affiliated with and hope to get funding from, and all that. And so that was, I think that's what I understood. And I got here, and I think I think it was very clear that, hey, I want to study with Don. And at the time, you were sort of running the fellowship, and we came up with a kind of mixed arrangement, right? Which was, okay, you can be Don's RA, even though technically his relationship with the Senate is different than it would have been before, but you sort of owe some time to Mercatus, right? And at the time, like Mercatus then and Mercatus now are such different animals, right? There was growing pain, and it was sort of figuring out its identity, and it was sort of learning what it was, and so at the time, it was, it was, it sort of begun entering into this sort of policy space, and so had a policy apparatus, and that policy apparatus, it didn't sort of make sense in some sense as its involvement in sort of graduate PhD student training didn't make sense. And we fixed that now and stuff like that. We can talk about that maybe later. But that was sort of, and so it was, so I can remember showing up there, and in the initial conversations, it being sort of really unclear what, if anything, I could do of value for that wing. And so, like, I managed, like, I'd been a software developer in like a previous life, and had sort of done that, and what have you, and so I made a proposition, and I said, look, you're about to, spend a bunch of money to hire a consultant to develop this software. I'll do that, and that'll free me from my, like, if I do that, then so I spent most of it. So I did that, and turns out it was a very easy thing for me to do given my background and experiences, and I spent the bulk of my time sort of working with Don. And so it wasn't, and so I know I have fellow graduate students at the time who would have different sorts of impressions, but that was like, mine was we had a very, the face of the Mercatus Center that I saw most of the time would be you, as the person who was overseeing the graduate, the PhD fellowship, and that you, and I think you built it very purposely with that kind of, Center for Study Market Process experience in mind. And so that was the, so in addition to the meetings groups and stuff like that I was doing with Don as a part of his sort of just the way he did scholarship, there were also the interactions that you were, cultivating with the graduate students at the time, and the things that you had us reading outside of class, and the things you were pushing us to do outside of class.
I do think that it's very fascinating to me. Pivotal people matter at pivotal times. I've become more and more convinced of that. And so, trajectories would be radically different if different people were in different roles at particular times. And I think that the center's evolution, which is, like any organization, it has, fits, and it's not a smooth, inevitable transition from where it was to where it is. But it matters how it evolved. And again, think about how the continuity of having someone like Tyler Cowen, there as a student when it first moved from Rutgers to then, its transition. So he understood things about it, which are kind of fascinating. And that matters. And I think you being able to have this experience with Don matters a lot. Whereas Jack, who was so integral to the center that I was part of, and Karen Vaughn and variety of people that were there in the 1980s, Victor Vanberg and Tom DiLorenzo, and a lot of those people had gone or were disappeared by the time I returned. And it was like, hard to negotiate, and so, Jack in particular was a very, significant, issue with me because I got along well with him. And so as soon as I came back, I tried to integrate him into everything, but yet there was like, he wanted to have this distance, and so it was like strange for me. But then I ended up by doing stuff, with him over in the public policy school, I'd be on dissertations and whatnot, but having him come back over. So it's fascinating. But I want to ask you a question about your own skill set, because I think that that's one of the things that really is quite fascinating as well. You mentioned already your ability to do computer science, which is significant, and that was revealed very early on in your graduate careers, that you had basically, especially for George Mason, you had the skills that were required to do maybe formal theory, and yet your attention was drawn to this more interpretive approaches of economics and broader, as you mentioned it here. Yet at the same time, you're in an economics department, and even economics department like GMU still gives you all the stars for being formally good, especially at a school like GMU, because if you stand out as someone who has those formal skills, everyone's like, oh my God, you have those formal skills, don't be a fool and, give it up, like the way that the profession can go. And yet, so at one time you have the people who view themselves as theorists rewarding you and encouraging you. And at the same time, you have this draw of this intellectual, this scholar, this almost like mythical figure scholar, because he's no longer in the economics department. But yet, if you would have talked to me, or if you talked to your old teacher or whatever, it's like, who do you listen to that's at George Mason? It's like, that guy, that's the guy to listen to. And by the way, think about how weird that is, because you have a Nobel Prize winner floating around. You have a distinguished fellow of the AEA floating around. And, instead people are saying, yeah, they're good. But this guy over here, the guy that wears, a piano, a scarf, and walks around with sneakers and a T-shirt and a suit jacket. That's the guy you got to listen to. So he's got this mythical, and he's completely the opposite, even though he himself also shared. That's why I laugh when you mentioned computer science, because Don himself was a computer science engineer, did that and everything like that. So how did you adjudicate those kind of things in your head? Because again, all the rewards are for you to use your skills to stand out against your peers.
Yeah. And so and I did, because I did, as you mentioned or hinted at, did sort of really well in the first year sequence, right? And sort of got the highest grade in the econ math class and stuff like that. And so, and I think, but one of the things I think there were two things that sort of stopped me from going that path. One was because I understood and sort of had that background in math and sort of understood it. I was acutely aware of its limits to answer the questions that I was concerned about. so it was sort of like I knew that this wasn't going to be. I understood it enough to not think of it as some sort of golden key to unlock whatever. I got that it had real limits, and particularly by that time I was I was very interested in questions of culture and economy. I got why that couldn't and wouldn't be able to address that kind of question. And so it was already like, okay, that's not gonna work. But and I think the second thing is that we can say it's hard for people who sort of aren't his students, I guess, maybe certainly hard for people who haven't met him to get the kind of gravitational pull that Don had. But you really, that was who I wanted to talk to. In some sense, that's still who I want to talk to, right? There's a lot of ways that the books that I'm writing now are still very much conversations that I'm having with Don at a lot of levels. And so it wasn't, and so I think that was it too. It was its thing. And you're right about the pressure that one of the cruel things that you did to us as graduate students was that at the end of our second year, you decided that what you would have the students in the PhD fellowship that were funded by Mercatus give job market style presentations to the economics faculty. Yeah. And so these are students by and large that are Austrian types giving presentations to a faculty that maybe, that's not the majority of the faculty, certainly not at the time. And there was, some real skepticism and hostility. And so, I get up there and I give a talk on, I was in the first talk of the day. I won't say who was, but the first talk of the day did not go well. Right? The sort of pushback from the audience was harsh.
Yeah.
and it was sort of like really devastating. And so I'm not the first talk of the day, and I go after that. And I, I'm giving a talk on how culture should reframe the way, like a Kuznerian approach to entrepreneurship, and I'm using folklore and these sort of cultural reads to like make the story, and I managed to like pull it off, right? Like I sort of give the talk and that I get back good questions and what have you. I think part of what was helpful in that regard is that the faculty in that room, who were maybe prone to be the most skeptical, knew me from their classes, and so they were, well, he's, he and so they sort of gave it a pass. But after that, there was a kind of, it wasn't an all-at-once intervention, but it was like almost a series of interventions. So multiple faculty now, some of whom are my colleagues now, sort of came to me and went, okay, so you clearly have skills.
Yeah.
Why would you possibly throw away your career to do this?
Yeah.
Like this is a mistake. Like you really shouldn't be doing this stuff. Like you really should be doing, serious economics, not this kind of thing. And so I think that ironically, made it less, sort of even made it less attractive to go that route, because it sort of made me feel like, well, maybe I'm onto something here. Maybe I'm.
Right. They didn't do it on intellectual grounds. They did it on purely pragmatic careerist grounds. Yeah. I think that's fascinating, actually. So that, by the way, that was an experiment that failed, and we haven't done it since. So it was an idea that was inspired but failed miserably, and I do remember that specific thing of the fact that you were able to do that dance quite well, and whereas others were not able to do that. But that also is borne out later on. I think that might have been one of the first pieces of evidence to start me thinking that there was something different from my working hypothesis, which is that, and this is not meant to sound cocky, but during a period of time when I first came out of graduate school, I would say between 1988 and 1994, I was pretty convinced that I could give a talk anywhere and everyone would be excited about what I had to say. And I got invited to all the universities up and down the East Coast, up and down the West Coast, and I gave my talks, and I was able to do all of that stuff and everything like that. And I thought, if I could do it, anyone could do it, and they could survive those kind of audiences, so you better start training right away. And it turns out that, I had an exogenous shock on my side, which was that communism was collapsing, and so everyone was concerned about what was going on with that. And so that aided in my case, but it's also the case that very few people can actually do that kind of dance, present an interpretive program to a formalist audience and still have them not reject you. But I also want to say something to you that I think is gets missed a lot of times, which is so here's the Don Lavoie that I knew. Again, given that he was a computer scientist, I'm in my first year of graduate school. Okay, what am I asked by Don to pay attention to during my first year of grad school? I'm studying math, econometrics, micro 1, micro 2. Micro 2 was a general equilibrium class at that time. Don tells me, read Morris Klein, Mathematics and the Loss of Certainty. Read Herbert Dreyfus, What Computers Can't Do. Read, Gödel Escher Bach by, Hofstadter, right? And then, so I'm in the middle of reading this stuff and I'm learning about computational arguments, the Gödel's theorem and all these things, computable ideas. And so to me, I'm sitting there and I'm looking at this, and again, I'm shocked by that economics is being presented in what actually would be not formalistic enough. If you really wanted to go formalism, you would go in a whole other, and so it's okay, I can learn this language. This is sort of, and Don's the reason for that. My undergraduate teacher, never would have steered me in that direction at all. It would have been just full suspicion about what's going on. Whereas Don, even though he was suspicious, he wanted to give you the tools so that you could engage in a sophisticated conversation about the kind of ideas that are going on. And that's so different, I think, than other people within the Austrian community about the way they think about the relationship to formalism. To this day, I'll never forget, sitting down and going through Dreyfus's What Computers Can't Do and just being blown away. And then from that, then reading, about the Chinese language test, all these other kind of things that were involved in debates that we're still having to this day. And I was being introduced to those by Don, in the early 80s, basically. So it's pretty amazing what he did as a teacher to prepare you to have a conversation in a non, rigid way with the people that were your teachers. And I do think, going back to your experience, this might be Don's weakness, maybe it's not. But Don never talked about how to have a career. Never. That was never what he talked about. It was purely the truth seeking. Every time you talked to him, there was not anything about, I got to say this in order to, be able to communicate with these people or whatever for jobs. It was you have to communicate with these people to advance truth, right? That was it. So there was a kind of romanticism that he had that was very attractive as well, I think.
He was critical of the talk. He was the only person after that talk that was critical of it. Yeah. He thought that I pulled too many punches. He said, well, you didn't say, you believe X and you didn't say X.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah. Well, he used to accuse me of having an economistic streak.
Yeah.
And so I remember one time he told me, could I come back and give another talk and less economistic this time? And I was like busting up. I was like, Don, all I said was that incentives matter. And he'd say, yeah, that's right. So he was like, kind of critical of that. It's interesting. Have you, as a mentor yourself, how do you talk to students that you've interacted with about this issue of career, truth seeking, modes of expression and discussion with people? I mean, do you have a strategy that you've worked out in your head?
Yeah, maybe. And so I think I begin where Don began too, which is to say, there's no point in writing a paper on something you're not interested in, and B, articulating something that you yourself don't find convincing, compelling, what have you, right? And so the game is a truth game, and the game is to be a good dialogical partner. Now, if you're doing something different than standard, then that puts the burden of proof is on you to overshoot the standard.
Yeah.
And so it would be much easier to write, whatever thing in a standard way, or to picture standard questions and go ahead with that. And that'll give you a certain kind of success and what have you. But if you're gonna A, pursue truth, B, you're attracted to this approach, then C, you've got to do it better. You just got to be better.
Yeah.
And so you've got to realize that for any journal that you get in, your paper is going to be held to a higher standard than papers written in that same journal in standard ways. Yeah. And you just got to live with that. And that's, if you're prepared to do that, that actually has advantages on the back end, which is that if you do get a hearing, then people come away impressed with your work.
Yeah. Because
then they say, oh, you might not get a hearing everywhere, but if you do get a hearing, then people come away and they say, okay, I see what this person's done here, that they've managed to meet this task in a serious, legitimate, straight, way.
Yeah. I want to make a comment, and then I actually want to pick up on a subject that's a little bit sensitive, actually. But I think it's important because of again, pivotal people mattering at pivotal times. But the one of them, the first one is that you remind me so much of Don in our interactions, because when I remember like several years ago, again, another experiment that I wanted to do was to have everyone do a deep dive in philosophy of science, again, influenced by Don, but I'm going to pick different people this time. And I decided to focus on Willard Quine and, the two dogmas of empiricism. So, I'm all excited about, the reading it. And I have my own reading, which is that he's critical of everyone else, but then he gives me space for my own position, right? Which is how I want to read him. But that requires that you don't read the second half of the essay. Because if you read the second half of the essay, then my position gets wiped out as well. So I'm aware of that, but I don't ever emphasize that because, who the hell wants their own position to be wiped away? And so I'm giving this talk and getting all excited about everything like that. And then you, in just this very understated way, say, but if we read the second part of the essay, and I'm like, this is just like Lavoie. I can't even cheat, when it's in my advantage, And as an old sports person, I grew up on the idea if you're not cheating, you're not trying hard enough. So I was devastated. What has enabled you to constantly keep that so that even then, if you put the thumb on the scale in the way that would go in your advantage, you still find a way to resist putting the thumb on the scale?
So I think it comes back to for me, it comes back to what's at stake, right? And so if we win, so like, let's put it back to the conversation about liberty. If we win that argument, right, and you sort of we manage to convince people that freedom is an essential condition for a flourishing human being, right? So we manage to convince people of that, but we do it in a way where it's, so we get to that conclusion in a way that's not that has weaknesses that we ourselves are aware of in the back of our minds.
Right.
Those weaknesses are going to be exposed, and the thing that we sort of were arguing for is going to fail. Right. And so because it's so important, that it's, to me at least, the notion is, well, that argument is so important that I want to win that argument with all the without me cheating to get me taking on maybe more burdens than I can, because if I win that argument, then it might have a solid foundation. And so like one of the things, one of the things I try to do, this is like sort of in a different life, but it's sort of illustrative of a point as a manager. My goal as a manager is to set up a condition where all of my, and this is the thing you emphasize too, where all of my supervisees thrive in such a way, and not just such a way internally, but thrive in such a way where their CVs are sufficiently robust that they can walk out the door at any moment.
Yeah.
That at any time they think we're not living up to our ideals, or we're not doing what we should be doing, or that we're not, we're sort of falling short, or we're not, rewarding them in the way that they deserve, or that they aren't being respected, they could say, you know what, I'm done. Yeah. And they would have built up a portfolio and built up a CV that gets them sort of better gigs, and yet they still stay, right? And so that's the way I sort of think about the arguments too, is that, okay, like I want to set it up where,
I love that, actually, so you don't have anything taint it like Lance Armstrong when the stakes are so high. So yeah, that's a very good one.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.